Hello, nerds. Thank you for watching Generally Nerdy. This is the Week in Nerdom, your source for daily nerd news updates every day of the week. We got a little behind on myself, so we've skipped a day, but it's all good. Everything's still happening. Normally, this would be Friday's video, and we would be talking comic books. We're still talking comic books, but it's Saturday, not Friday. So this week in comic books, we've got a new major character over in the X universe. We have some really interesting DC news, and then for reviews, we're going to be doing these guys right here. All three of these are getting reviewed today on Generally Nerdy, so let's hit the intro real quick so we can get to the things. So real quick bit of housekeeping before we jump into the actual episode is we're not going to be doing the normal episodes next week. What we will be doing is the live recording. So Monday night we will be recording live at my local comic book shop, and hopefully we'll get some turnout in the audience. The first half of the show is going to be headlines, so basically what I do 5 days a week on the Week in Nerdom, and then the second half of the show is going to be discussion with whoever does show up, and we're this month, because we're going to be doing this every final week of the month, for the near future at least. I don't know how long it's going to last, but at least for the next few months we're going to be doing this. And this month's topic for the second half of the show is about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and whether it's time for a reboot or what exactly we're going to be getting in Phase 5. We're going to be getting in as deep in depth with that as possible. And yeah, so that's what you have to look forward to next week. I haven't exactly decided if I'm going to chop it into 2 videos. We'll see how it plays out. But let's talk comic books, shall we? First on the list for news this week is Rob Liefeld. We've talked at least twice about him kind of sort of announcing but not giving any details on some big projects he's working on for Marvel, specifically in the X-Men side of Marvel, and we got a little bit of detail from him this week, and it's all about Major X. Major X is going to be a new character is what he's saying, so it's Liefeld. I'm sure that's a legit statement. We're going to get into some of the later news today that is not legitimately a new character, but again, we'll get to that. But Major X rather is so he's not only introducing a new character who is apparently going to be a main character in the X universe going forward, but he's also introducing a new multiverse aspect, kind of, a little bit. Major X is from a place called Existence, so much like a lot of the things in the X-Men universe, it's spelled with an X and not an EX at the beginning, X-Existence. So, and Existence was created, and it's, so, again, I probably have to read this a little more directly. So, what he told Entertainment Weekly he said, Major X hails from a different plane of being called Existence, like we just said. A mutant Shangri-La, a safe haven that has been a realm where mutant kind has lived in peace and harmony. They escaped there following a tragedy that befell mutant kind, so we're gonna get some history. There's gonna be probably a lot of exposition in the first few books, so I would imagine the first 2 to 3 books of this arc are not going to be great. But yeah, he continues. There are some familiar faces that he has forged this other society with. So that almost is implying that it could be somebody that we know. Obviously you can tell from the artwork, he's wearing a mask, so we don't know Even if it's a he, it could be a she, though. Again, looking at the artwork, it looks pretty male. Not indicative of anything with Marvel these days, but stronger potential, I guess. So he forged this other society with some familiar faces, which also means we're probably going to be seeing, I don't even know, potentially Magneto, because it's a place where mutant kind is exalted. Mutant kind is alone. There are no humans in existence. So very likely Magneto is going to be a part in the creation of existence. How it's going to factor in, we won't know until it comes out, obviously. Continuing. But then, a terrible event happens within existence that causes Major X to cross over and land in the Marvel Universe that we know. But he doesn't land on the spot he was hoping, so in the first issue, he's in 1991. We progressively get him to where he needs to go. By the conclusion of the story, we catch up to modern-day Marvel. The book is set to come out in April. We will talk about previews in the coming week. If you are a patron, $1 a month, you get to join that previews conversation. I try and do it as early in the month as possible, usually a Monday or a Tuesday. We've only had one so far because this is still the first month of the year, and this is a new thing that we're doing. So that might get pushed back a week. I don't know. It just depends on when I can get my hands on the previews. So, we will be talking a little bit more about this, but it does start in April, and it is going to be a 6-issue miniseries, which is really interesting because DC is all about the 12-issue maxi, and Marvel is all about the 8 to 6-issue mini. So, just an interesting dichotomy to draw, but that's what we have from Rob Liefeld about his new character. Probably not going to be as popular as Deadpool, but you never know. I feel like Deadpool was kind of lightning in a bottle, and it's not going to strike twice. But we're meandering and bird walking and such, so let's just move on to the next bit of news. And next up, we're talking Spider-Man. It seems we talk more and more Spider-Man as the show gets older and older, which is interesting because I'm still really not reading a whole lot of Spider-Man, unless you count Venom. I'm reading some Venom right now, Venom and Carnage and such. So that's Spider-Man adjacent, but not Spider-Man directly. But the bit of news we're talking about with Spider-Man has to do with the black suit. No, not technically coming back. This is going to be a mini-series that takes place when the original Black Suit series started. So back in 84. Is that right? Wow, that's a long time ago. So this is just going to be like other things that happened when Peter Parker first had the symbiote. Before even he really knew it was a symbiote, some of them. It sounds like they're going to be just a couple of issues, like each little thing is going to be kind of a vignette, even though they're all part of the same story arc. They're not going to be directly tied, is kind of what it sounds like, which is really interesting, kind of an anthology / supplemental series even, so that has a lot of potential to be really cool. And this actually, the reason I wanted to bring this up is because this kind of brings up another conversation that has been had recently. CBR did a really poorly done but still interesting deeper dive into why the 90s are returning in the comic book tropes and why storylines are starting to resemble stuff that happened way back when that's quote unquote the most lauded era of comic books. That's not entirely true. The reason the 90s comic books, quote unquote, were no good is because they were oversaturating the market. It was because there was people thought that every comic book that came out was going to be a collector's item, so the big book companies were publishing way too many, and they oversaturated the market, and that's why there was a comic book crash towards the end of the 90s. Not because the stories weren't good, because that's actually what most people in my approximate age group grew up reading, and that's where the base knowledge comes from. That's where a lot of what we know of today's comic book characters was firmly established, because up until that point, with a fair amount of them, and this started actually in the late 80s into the 90s, mid to late 80s even, it's like the beginning of the modern era, I think, is technically what the classification is. That's a lot of backstories before then were kind of fluid, if you to use a popular term. It was whatever suited that particular story. Aquaman has a different backstory up until this era. Batman's backstory was not solidified. Well, no, I take that back. Batman's backstory was solidified in the 60s, if I remember correctly. So that one doesn't really count. But there was a lot of crazy experimentation, a lot more Elseworld stuff before this era of comics, and now everything is, anyone who believes that the 90s comics were bad was not reading comics in the 90s. So that's why this Spider-Man story is really interesting, because it's expounding on a lot of Spider fans. It's expounding on some of their favorite material, and I think that's a fantastic move for Marvel. Marvel is definitely course correcting these days, and they're doing it in a great direction, and I can totally get behind some of what they've decided to do. We'll get into some of that when we get into reviews. But before we get into reviews, we've got one more thing of news to talk about, and that is over in the DC side of comic books, and it's the Arkham Knight. We've had, I believe it was three proper comic book series, potentially even more, because it was 3 going into the final video game. So at least 7 proper series of Arkham Knight. For those that don't know, Arkham Knight is the villain that was created, quote unquote, for the Batman Arkham video games. So Arkham Asylum, Arkham City, and Arkham Knight. He was the villain in the last game. And if you did not play that, if you are unfamiliar with the story, I'm going to spoil it. So if you haven't played it and you really want to, you're almost, 5 years too late. So I feel like it's fair game to be spoiled. The Arkham Knight is just Jason Todd coming back as somebody other than the Red Hood, but basically still doing the same thing. The story was only changed slightly in order to fit into that offshoot universe. But by and large, the broad strokes are exactly the same, what we got in the Red Hood book Under the Red Hood, when it first came out. So now they're announcing, I gotta get the... Brad Walker, who is normally just a penciler at DC. He's done stuff with Supergirl and The Demon. Hell is Earth, I guess is the name of the book. I've never read it. I don't know. But he will be joining Peter J. Tomasi, Andrew Hennessy, and Nathan Fairbairn. Fairbairn? That's how it looks like it's spelled. After we get the big Detective Comics number 1000, this will be book 1001. And this is going to be the introduction of the Arkham Knight into DC proper. Why? We have in Rebirth, we have a book called Red Hood and the Outlaws. That is a thing that exists even after this newest reboot of the universe. Why do we need another Jason Todd? I mean, if it was a Jason Todd book, it would kind of make more sense, because Red Hood and the Outlaws is not just Jason Todd. But then it would just be called Red Hood and not Arkham Knight, but it's not really a book. It could be a spinoff. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what the thought behind this is, but whatever it is, I honestly don't think it's going to turn out well. I think a lot of fans are going to be intrigued and pick up this 1001, and then if it does spin off into something else, it's not gonna last more than maybe a 12-issue maxi. Anything beyond that, it's living on borrowed time if it makes it that far. I just don't see the need to add the Arkham Knight to the proper DC canon. It was barely worth it to do it in the video game. If you played the game and you didn't see it coming within the first hour of playing this game, then you haven't been paying attention and you don't deserve to read the books. But that's just me getting judgmental. This also is going to be in April, and no word. There is the potential though, but this is not confirmed. This is me just hoping and conjecturing. Potentially they could be introducing the Arkham Knight to the DC canon because they want to have it be somebody other than Jason Todd. And that would be a good idea. If you have a similar character, because Arkham Knight in the end, just like the Red Hood, becomes part of the Bat family. So if you have a similar character to Jason Todd as the Red Hood, but doesn't make that turn to become a good guy, doesn't make that turn to be part of the Bat family, is just legitimately somebody who can think just as fast and just as smart as Bruce, or Batman, however you want to say it, I think that is a great addition. I don't think that's the way they're going to go, though. But that's the end of news for the week, guys. Let's jump into the reviews. Before we jump into the reviews this week, guys, let me remind you about the Patreon. Patreon.com/generallynerdy for more content, monthly discords, contributor and producer credits, and much more, depending on the tier to which you subscribe. Again, Patreon.com/generallynerdy, because I'm too poor and don't have a staff to do a paywall myself. Patreon.com/generallynerdy. And now let's review some stuff. First book on the list for this week in reviews. We talked about it when it was announced. It has finally come out. Actually, all three of the books that we're going to be talking about today in reviews, we talked about when they were initially announced. So, all three are number ones, which is very interesting. I get the feeling, because again, this is a relatively new segment, get the feeling we're going to be doing a lot of number ones and probably not a whole lot beyond those, unless it's a really, really good number one. But first on the list this week, as I birdwalk some more, is Naomi. This is the second book in the Wonder Comics line that Brian Michael Bendis started over on DC just last week. Was it last week? Yeah. Only just last week. With the Young Justice book that we talked about last week. So this, I got this for two reasons. First is because we talked about it. I'm still very interested because Brian Michael Bendis. But we talked about it when it was announced. And I want to see, second, what the big mystery is, because this is supposed to be affecting the entire DC universe. Even though it's a different imprint, everything that happens in Wonder Comics is going to be canon in the primary universe. What to say about this book? First, let's start with what's amazing about this book. The art in this, what's the guy's name? Jamal Campbell does incredible art. This, I can't even, let's jump over to the other camera real quick. So, this is the first page. This is what we get, and it's nothing really knock your socks off on the very first page, but it is solid. There's a definite style here. We got the hard outlines, and we got you're going to see a lot of this pulpy kind of background. The layout for these, because we get this page a couple of times. The layout for this is interesting. These are quasi interviews. Don't know exactly if it's the news people are talking to them, or if this is just them recounting the story to their friends. But then you turn the page, and this is the most striking thing we're going to be looking at all freaking week. This is the coolest freaking splash. Oh my god. Yeah. We've swapped the hard black outline for this hard white, and just everything in this, your eyes are drawn exactly where they need to go. They're right to the action, but there's still all of the detail around here, and just it's so good. And you can follow this. This is laid out very, very well. Again, Campbell is just killing it. So and it's even more, and I can't even say how much I love this art. I know it's very probable that what he's done is rendered everything and then drawn over the 3D renders. I am totally okay with it in here because this all feels supernatural. The one panel, there might be more, but there's only one panel in this entire book that I had any sort of issue with, and it's this one here, because the motion seems awkward. She's obviously running because that's why we have the motion blur on the frame, but like she looks like she's teetering, and I don't know, it just seems super freaking awkward. Which is very much out of place in the rest of this book because everything else is so well balanced. This whole page, the layout itself, again, kind of boring. That will factor into the rating, but just the framing inside of the individual frame, because all four of these are the same frame, right? So the framing, we have the three people that we care about, Naomi and her two friends, and they're obviously in the middle of a group, but instead of making the whole group exactly the same kind of art, they're faded into the background with the coloring, and just freaking brilliant. The writing in this, Bendis is super expositional, and it really shows when Naomi's hanging out with her friends, and that kind of gets to be a little taxing to read. But when you're looking at artwork like this, like here, when you're looking at stuff like that's just it makes up for the overly heavy exposition. And then again, we get these. This is Naomi interrogating these people, not them recounting anything. It's really difficult to see who's the big mystery. She's looking to see if any supers have visited her little town before, because that's what this whole thing was at the beginning. It's the first time Superman's ever done anything outside of Metropolis, which is untrue, but that's the mythology that they're inserting, I guess, into this story. And again, we get more of the pulpy kind of backgrounds, and see, there doesn't have to be a whole lot going on in the background for it to look good. This is super stylized, more of the pulpy stuff, and even when we're here with her friends, I don't know how well that's translating in the screen. Right here, we get even more of that pulpy texture, and I really think that was a really cool addition. So, this guy, this is the intrigue of this issue. Is this guy apparently knows something, and we get to learn on the last page, I'm not going to go all the way to the end, but we get to learn on the last page that he does actually know something, but we don't know what it is, and there's a couple of hints dropped earlier in the story about why that matters. So basically, there's a big secret in this town, and Naomi is adopted is the implication. We don't know that for 100%, but that's the implication, is that Naomi is adopted, much like Superman. Actually, no, they do say it explicitly when she's talking to her therapist. In this scene, she's talking about how people forget that Superman's adopted, and that's one of the other mythology issues that I have with this is people don't know Superman's secret identity, So how would they know that he's adopted? That's wrong. that's a glaring issue. So yeah, aside from the major story wrecking mythology issue, this is super solid. Like, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Let's get into the scores so I can finish gushing. So Naomi #1 general score is a 90 out of 100. The biggest reason we went that high is, even with the exposition, it doesn't, like, it gets a little taxing because it's like, all right, they're explaining, but it's the first issue, so you kind of have to give them a little bit of leeway. It's the first issue ever with this character at all, so again, you kind of have to give them a little bit of leeway, but the art is so superb that really brought the general score up. Just the layouts, even though the panel layouts weren't the best, again, that's why we brought it down. The panel layouts weren't fantastic, but the panels themselves, what's happening inside that frame, every one of those, except for the one that we talked about, that one exception, I feel like every one of those tells you exactly what you need to know, and does it in such a way that it doesn't pull you out of it. There's no glaring open spaces. There's no obvious 3D renders. You know, none of the pitfalls that most of the other big Marvel books even are falling into. None of those apply. And so that definitely salvaged the general score because, again, it's a first issue and we get a lot of exposition. So yeah, general score 90 out of 100. Mythology, I could have misread or misunderstood the intention behind that. There is the possibility that they're talking metaphorically, because everybody knows that Superman is an alien, so he was adopted by the people he's protecting. But the way it was phrased doesn't imply that. The way it was phrased implies that this therapist knows that Superman was adopted by the Kents. Maybe not the Kents specifically, but was adopted by a couple and was raised that way. So that's not the mythology. I don't know that that's ever been the mythology. Even in Secret Origins, that weird alternate universe thing, that wasn't the mythology there either. So I don't know what Bendis is doing, why that was the thing. And then also, but that's story, so we'll get into that in a minute. Anyway, mythology is a 77 out of 100 because that is a glaring issue. Aside from that, we're creating a new mythology. Because that's not part of the created mythology, because that deals directly with Superman. So we're setting up a new mythology for Naomi, though, and that's kind of why I didn't go harsher on the mythology score with that crazy issue, because the focus of this book is not going to be Superman. The focus of this book is going to be Naomi, and it wasn't the best way to set up a new mythology, but it also has you interested enough to read more. So that bodes well for the book. So again, 77 out of 100 for mythology. Next up is story, and I really dug the story, though I don't want Bendis to fall into the Tom King realm of thinking, in that if I keep secrets the whole time and don't give my audience anything to figure it out, if I just sit on everything and then right at the end I share all of the twists all at once, then they're gonna think I'm great. Bendis is already a pretty great author. I'm not one of those that dislikes Brian Michael Bendis. That being said, I know he can write a better mystery. So And I also kind of felt like the mystery elements, while it was throughout, it was mostly in the last few pages, is where we really got clued into why Naomi cares about this mystery, and the intrigue of the fact that apparently something happened in this town, and nobody wants to talk about it except for that big muscle guy at the garage. I wanted just a little bit more of a clue as to what the big muscle guy at the garage knew. I wanted a little bit more of a clue as to why this really mattered to Naomi. We didn't really get either of those, so we're looking at an 85 out of 100 in story. Just Bendis is better than that. That's... And then, enjoyability is the last score. And this, remember, is the subjective end of the spectrum. And subjectively, this was a pretty solid book. The one thing really took me out of it. The rest of it was me wanting more. So that's a good thing. That's always a good thing. 88 out of 100 for enjoyability. I really feel like number ones, especially when it's a brand new story, when it's especially a brand new character, number ones are always doomed to be pretty bland. This was not much of an exception, aside from the fantastic art, so we couldn't really give it an A, but it was very, very close. So 88 out of 100 for enjoyability. Next, for reviews, guys, we are talking Buffy, number 1, Boom Studios. This is the second Boom Studios book that we've done in as many weeks. We talked, I think it was actually 3 weeks ago. I need to write these things down. We talked about the Firefly. Yeah, it was last week. Firefly number 2 is what we talked about, because we didn't talk about number 1, because I wasn't 100% sure of how I felt in number 1. I wanted to give it another book before we talked about it on the Week in Nerdom. So, this is number 1. I felt like it was important to hit the number 1 for this series because I may or may not have continued reading it. I was a passive fan of the series when it was airing. When it was on Netflix, again, more recently, it's not there now, but it was about a year ago. Me and my girlfriend watched every episode again, and it holds up pretty well in spite of, the technology issues and whatever, but still, story-wise, it's still engrossing, still, definitely solid Joss Whedon writing and directing. So I felt like it was important to catch number 1 on here because I may or may not have continued reading it. After having picked up book number 1, I feel like I'll give it a few books before I make the decision to stop reading it. So we'll make it at least to number 5 before I decide yay or nay. We're not going to talk about everyone on the channel, but we will, if things go drastically one way or the other, we'll definitely talk about it then. But how is this one before we get into Beyond? This one was the first time I read through it, it kind of gave me a lot of hope for the series. It was solid, and I need to clue you guys in. When I first read a comic book, I don't pay a whole lot of attention to each page. I just thumb through and get a feel for the book. I read some of the dialogue, I look at the action, I look at the art, the kind of some of the framing, some of the layouts, and that kind of stuff. Just a real quick kind of breeze through. And then on second reading, that's when I get into the details. And on the broad strokes, this is almost as brilliant, if not as brilliant, as the Firefly book that we talked about last week. But then you get in a little bit deeper, and it starts to lose some of its shininess. And let's get into the other camera angle, and I'll explain a little better. So, first, the first thing, and I noticed this when the book was announced and we talked about it and we were looking at this artwork to begin with, the head proportion is just a little bit off, and it's normally not something I really care all that much about, but it's just enough that it's like, yeah, her head's just a little too big for her body. It doesn't look natural. So first page, right off the bat, we already see some of the things that have changed. And on this page, I can show you one thing I have a little bit of an issue with, and one thing I think is kind of funny and an interesting but not a negative change to the story. The interesting but not negative change to the story is Buffy's job. Tooniverse. I don't remember. Again, it's been almost a year since I watched the show last, and I was kind of only passively watching it most of the time. So my memory might not be the greatest of the series, but I don't remember Buffy having a job that we ever spent any time in. Like, yeah, I'm pretty sure she had a job once or twice, aside from the magic shop in the later seasons that Giles owned after she graduated high school. But other than that, she never had a boring fast food job, and especially not one that we saw in the series. So that is an interesting change. Kind of adds a new layer to the character that I think is not negative and potentially not necessarily positive, just interesting. And then the thing that I have issue with are these bubbles, the narration bubbles. If you look at them, it's kind of Doogie Howser-ish in that it looks like it's her typing a journal. And we're going to see later that it is kind of sort of her typing a journal, but we'll get there when we get there. But it just doesn't feel... The dialogue feels like somebody trying a little too hard to mimic Joss Whedon dialogue. It's a monologue, I guess, is technically, because she's talking to herself. At first, it was like, oh, that's kind of clever. Some of the vocabulary in those boxes is like, oh, that's kind of clever. But then again, you go back through and pay a little bit more attention to it. It's like, oh, she watched the show, but now she's more just trying to mimic and not... Yeah, it just feels a little stilted, I guess is the best way to put it. As far as the layouts go, this feels like, and maybe this is intentional and maybe it's not, but it feels like the early CW, or at the time when this aired, WB television. Like there's not a whole lot of interesting camera movement. We get this close up on his mouth for some reason that doesn't. Kind of boring. There's nothing, like, even from the Naomi layouts, there was some interesting stuff that they did with the framing. Nothing really stands out as far as the framing here. And then we get into one of our first mythology issues. Buffy is a very popular franchise. Buffy has the strong potential to run for a long time. There is absolutely no reason for her to blow her cover in the first issue of the book. That is unnecessary. Yes, I understand that Xander and Willow are going to play a pretty major part in the future, but in the series, it took some time for her to show off, to let them into her world. It was quite a few episodes in. It wasn't the first freaking episode, so that kind of stuck out to me a little bit. If we were 5 issues in, everything that happens in this scene would be fantastic, because that's about where you would expect her to have made friends with these two and then blow her cover. This happening in the first issue, even though this art is great. It feels like you're watching an anime version of Buffy. The dialogue in this scene specifically is some of the better dialogue in the entire book, but it's just happening way too soon. Way too soon. So yeah, that and the art and the quasi-similarity to the actors who played them in the series, all of that is really cool. I really dig that. Oh, and then the next issue, that doesn't look like a real comic book. That just looks like awkward children's drawings. This is the next big issue. This is the not the awkward children's drawing. This is the next big issue. So she's in a graveyard, on a grave that we can assume was just buried that day. There's no reason not to. We get more of these really annoying monologue bubbles, more of the exposition, more of her talking to herself or writing her journal, and then we see hands come and lift the lid, presumably, of this. Now, this is a brand new vampire, because he just came out of his grave. And somehow, he has this little amulet that keeps him alive. And he's heard about this, or he knows who the Slayer is, and knows a witch who's keeping him alive, and that just doesn't make any sense. He's a fresh vampire. Did he get turned on purpose? From my remembrance of the series, that's not a thing that a lot of vampires do, because the human wants to turn. They only turn humans to be cruel, not because it's what the human wants. Really standard, nothing again special about these layouts. And we get to Anya, who I'm fairly sure was actually in the book, or in the series, or in the TV series. My memories of the villains of that series that weren't Spike or Drusilla or Angel at times, or the Master in the first, 2 or 3 seasons, is kind of shaky. So I can't remember specifically, because it kind of sounded familiar, maybe a little bit. But so we meet her, we see that she's ruthless because she kills this guy. He's a fresh vampire. What does she care? Like, none of that scene makes sense. There's no reason for that to have happened that way. There's a better way for us to learn about this amulet. And then so she tells Giles about the amulet, and Giles sends her off to class. And then this is the next one. The dialogue, again, in this scene, like, it feels like, who's the writer? Jordi Belair. It feels like she got some of the dialogue, not necessarily most. She got some of the dialogue really, really well. She got the rest of the dialogue is just hard to read. So this is where we see Xander in this whole scene is on this computer. This whole scene, we could see the light from the screen right here lighting up their faces. It's in his lap. So there's no reason for us to assume that this wouldn't be the computer screen. Like, it potentially is her phone screen, but that doesn't make sense because she's not on her phone in the rest of these panels. So we get her computer screen that's in Xander's lap, but it's her thoughts that are on this screen. So Xander's reading her journal. It's so weird. It's so weird. And then the last page, we get a reveal for a vampire. Oh, and one little Easter egg that I thought was pretty cool. Anya, I'm presuming that's Anya. We don't know for certain, but we do know for certain because this vampire lady uses her name in the next page that I'm not going to show you. But she's watching as she's taking care of this store after hours for reasons. She's watching Serenity or Firefly or whatever, but that's obviously the Serenity that's on her screen. So pretty cool little Easter egg. We don't learn this vampire lady's name. There is never a time in this book, because on the last page, she just says, "I'll take what I want, Anya," and that's the end of it. We get to see her as a vampire, like looking like the vampires did from the series, but not. There's a lot of greatness about this book, but there's a lot of bad as well. So, general score for Buffy #1 from Boom Studios is, I went a little harsh, 65 out of 100, because of all of the reasons we've already gone over. It could have been better on so many levels, from almost everything. Like the little bit of action that we got was well drawn, was well framed. Everything else, though, felt like it was subpar. So 65 of 100. I really wanted to give it a higher score than that, but there was too much clunkiness in this issue. Mythology Score for issue number 1 is a 79 out of 100. I recognize that this is setting up a new mythology. Jordie Bellaire, I'm sorry if I pronounced it Jodie before, Jordie Bellaire, this is her take. This is an original with existing characters. This is a different story. This is a different origin. So you have to take that in consideration. I tried to set aside my bias for this particular score, but there still is inconsistencies, like the freaking brand new vampire already having the medallion. So yeah, Mythology is a 79 out of 100. Story, in the broad strokes, was really good. In the details, was a little less good. But story, I feel like this is a good setup, again, for her new mythology. So, the couple of minor tweaks that I had, the change the journal thing, why is it in Xander's hands, really didn't work against it as much on the story level. Overall, the story actually is very compelling. So we're going for an 85 out of 100 on story. And then the completely subjective enjoyability. In spite of its flaws, in spite of, at times, it feeling like the dialogue was written by somebody who just wants to be Joss in not a good way. Like the Serenity book that we read, Firefly book rather, that we read last week, that one was somebody imitating Joss well. This one, we got 2 scenes of somebody imitating Joss well, and the rest of the book is a poor substitute. But in spite of that, you still get a great feeling about these characters. It's still, even with the logic issues, there's still a whole lot to enjoy about this book. There's plenty to enjoy about this book. So we're going with a 92 out of 100 for the enjoyability on Buffy. I feel like that was a little overly generous, again, considering it's a number 1. 92 is probably one of the highest scores I'll give a number 1 for enjoyability, but it's because there wasn't too much exposition. It was just the way the exposition was given to us could have been better, is all. And then our last book for the week is Guardians of the Galaxy number 1. It's really interesting that we're getting a number 1 in a book that's been around for quite some time. It hasn't changed hands necessarily. I mean, it's a new writer, Donny Cates, but it's been in existence for a little while. So why are we getting a new number 1? Well, because it's a new team, so that kind of makes sense. And we even get legacy numbering. We'll get into that in the other camera angle. So let's switch cameras real quick. All right. So number 1, legacy though 151. So that's always a good thing. We talked about this. You remember the cover? We've talked about this. We've got Beta Ray Bill, Phyla-Vell, Star-Lord, Gladiator, so much going on up front, Groot in the background. We were trying to figure out, because we were told not everyone on this cover is going to become one of the Guardians, and that was very true. So let's get into it. We've got, first off, this is probably the coolest layout of the entire week, which is really funny to me because it's a Marvel book, and generally speaking, Marvel books are pretty bland in the way the panels are laid out. So I really dig this opening page. I think this is one of the coolest, again, layouts that we got all week. The rest of the book, not as much, but still probably the better of the three. Naomi had a couple of spots of brilliance, but not quite as much. So we were picking up, remember, spoiler alert, Thanos is dead. He's lost his head to his future daughter because comic books. We have his brother right here talking to everyone. Eros is... He's supposed to be upset, but in these early panels, he kind of looks mournful. Because his brother did die, sure, but, I mean, his brother was freaking Thanos. And then we get the introduction to why all of these superheroes are here. We've got Beta Ray, we've got Ghost Rider. Again, some people I can't recognize, but I probably should because, yeah, they're fairly common. And then we have Thanos addressing them because this is his last will and testament. And effectively what he's saying is he was not going to die in any uncertain terms. He is not going to die by anyone else's hand. He wants to dictate his death. And so since he lost his head in a way that he couldn't have dictated, he has arranged to have his consciousness... Right here is where it says it. Where is it? Right here. Have my consciousness uploaded and implanted into the mind of another upon my untimely demise. Because he wants to die eventually. He wants to go live with Lady Death. That's his end game. But since he didn't get to dictate that, he's going to... I don't know how that stops. I mean, you've gone from a consciousness to a bunch of ones and zeros that is artificial. I don't know because reasons, because comic books. So Eros says, I brought you all here because you're not afraid to get your hands dirty even though you're good guys. And then why aren't the Guardians of the Galaxy here? And then we cut over to Peter Quill in a new ship, and Groot is talking. I don't know if this is supposed to be just a translation, though usually translations, you've got the caret, the two open carets and the two closed carets around it, and then the translation, it says across the bottom, translated from Grootish, or whatever, you know what I mean? So he's not just saying, I am Groot, he's saying, asterisks you... Yeah, I am Groot yourself too. So that's what makes me think, that's the one line of dialogue that makes me think, are we actually getting the translation in these? Because that's what Peter Quill heard was, I am Groot, or is that just a bad joke? It just, and then down here, Quill, shut up, look. Like, does he understand Grootish? I don't know what's going on. Nowhere is not there. That will come into play later. This is just kind of, now they're all talking because Eros is saying we're going to have to kill quite a lot of people because they have to stop Thanos from doing things. These are all the potential people that they have decided maybe Thanos has uploaded his consciousness to, but there's no explanation for any of them. The closest we get to an explanation is Gamora, because obviously that's his daughter, so and he had a pretty good relationship with her, so that makes some sort of sense. We have Phyla-Vell flying off the handle saying, yeah, we do need to kill her. I should have killed her a long time ago. Moondragon stops her. Just interesting. Not great, but interesting. And then we get, this is where Nowhere went. Nowhere is here doing things, like holding this meeting place. And then we get the Black Order. And there's a battle, and just it so doesn't make sense what's going on here. The art's great. And even then, it's not the greatest. It's pretty slightly above average, I guess, but it's consistent, so that's working in its favor, kind of. Another quasi goofy scene with Star-Lord, and then opened up a portal that sucks through some of the crowd that was here in this meeting place, and while the Black Order takes Thanos' headless body. And then that black hole or whatever that they opened spits them out where the Guardians are. And I don't know, man. I just don't know. He lands here. So Beta Ray, it's Beta Ray Bill. Beta Ray Bill, Moondragon, Phyla-Vell, and the Ghost Rider. And Quill rather, makes them a part of his team because he says so. The Nova Corps is trying to arrest them. But so, where is it? We've lost them. So they're asking if they're okay, and they're saying we've lost them. And he lists Corsair, Starjammers, Silver Surfer, Imperial Guard, the Skrulls, gone. Are they implying that all of them are dead? Because that definitely didn't happen in panel, so I can't believe a word that Beta Ray Bill is saying right there. We don't see them die, we see them fighting. So that just doesn't jibe well at all. And then we have the Nova Corps is trying to arrest them because reasons, and this part legitimately made me laugh out loud. Quill. Why do I keep saying Quinn? Quill is saying that they're his new crew, so that the Nova Corps can't arrest them, and then Ghost Rider said, "Wait, no! I ain't signing on to be a member of the Guardians of the Galaxy." And then that cuts us back to the Black Order, and this is one of the other issues I had with this book. Aside from the what the hell is going on, we got the meanwhile in nowhere, it would seem, and I think we're supposed to assume that Proxima is talking to someone that we don't see. But the only time that there's a dialogue bubble that implies that is here, or no, not here, here. This right here implies that she's talking to someone, but we never, and after reading it twice, I caught on that this was supposed to be whoever she's reading, or talking to. But nothing in this establishing shot, in either of these establishing shots, shows that. So the only actual shift, and I'm gonna, if I get dinged for this, then it's whatever. The shift we get again Proxima, and then all of the sudden Hela. When I first read this, again, my first reading's always pretty broad strokes. When I first read this, I was like, did Proxima just become Hela? What the hell is going on? But no, that she's apparently, I'm assuming this is supposed to be a floating throne, and that's where she's knelt. There's just no depth, and you don't. It's just the art's too confusing. There's a much better way to have done that. There was way too much. I dug this book more than I thought I was going to. Let's just say that. But let's get into the review scores real quick. General score for this, technically, it could have been so much better. But that's most Marvel books anymore, right? Is they have so much potential, but they don't have the right staff behind it. There was too much I can't even put it in words. I can't. There was so much crap on these panels, but at the same time, some really interesting stuff. So it's 65 again out of 100 because all of the reasons, because we get all of this exposition, which is the great setup, because it's not the entire first half of the book. It's just a few pages at the beginning gives us this exposition, but then the artwork is okay, and they're insinuating deaths that don't actually happen on screen or on panel. It just so much could have been so much better about this book. So 65 rather out of 100. As far as the mythology goes, I felt like we don't get a whole lot of mythology in this book. It felt really clunky, though, the bit that we did get, and the Thanos-Gamora link kind of salvaged that a little bit, because it would make sense that Thanos would try and upload his consciousness into Gamora, so that kind of salvaged it. But again, we don't get enough. I know it sounds like I'm going back and forth. Too much exposition, not enough exposition, but it's legit. We only needed a little bit more in this exposition, though. We only needed a little bit. Why that list of people? You don't have to go into each one individually, but how did you conclude that was your list of people that are going to have to die? There's a lot that you have to infer in here that you shouldn't necessarily have to infer, even if this was some sort of big epic mystery, which I feel like it's not going to be that epic of a mystery. There should have been a little bit more reasoning behind why we did the things we did in this book. And yeah, so sorry, I'm burying the lead. The mythology score for this was a 72 out of 100. Could have been much better. Wasn't really. And yeah, next we're getting the story. In the broad strokes, you understand what's going on until the last 2 pages. Fine. In the details, a lot of that is unnecessary. You get, so story is one of the stronger, because again, the broad strokes totally made sense. We've got a 78 out of 100 this time, almost a B. It was enough to keep you going, but still could have been fleshed out in a much better way. And then our enjoyability score, it's an issue number 1. So number 1s always do well. Number 1s generally do a quasi decent job, at least, of setting up the rest of the story arc at the very least. I feel like this, in spite of its flaws, did that all right. It didn't do it great, but it was slightly above average, and I've said that a couple of times. So the enjoyability score on this was an 80 out of 100. I will definitely pick up book 2, but if book 2 is just as much gobbledygook, then that's where this ends. But if book 2 kind of cleans up some of this mess and we get going a little more solid, then we'll probably talk about it a couple books down the road. But that's where this week's episode for comic books ends, guys. Remember, next week there will not be individual episodes. We will have headlines and then the discussion at the live taping. So stay tuned for that. But for this week, what did I miss? What should we talk about in the next episode, the next proper episode? Let me know in the comments down low. Let me know what you want me to review. We will have that conversation also down low in those comments. If you're new to Generally Nerdy, then definitely click the subscribe button or the follow button wherever you're watching. If you like the episode, click the like button. If you want to go deeper into the conversation on any of this stuff or all of this stuff or any other nerdy bits, then there is a website, generallynerdy.net. At the top of that website, you will see a tab that says General Store. That is where you can go get your nerdy swag. I just put up 2 new shirts last week, so go check those out. I will be getting those designs onto other bits, but getting them onto the shirts was a bit of a task. So they're up there now. They're working. You can purchase them. Go check it out. GenerallyNerdy.net and the General Store tab across the top. If, though, you are falling behind on your nerd news and you want to catch up, then you can definitely click or tap that box right there to the left of my face to do that. But before we do any of this stuff, before we click that box or go to that website or whatever, guys, always remember that if it's generally nerdy, it's probably here.